The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by centuries of royal history. At 75 years old, he had finally reached the throne he had waited his entire life to occupy, but the weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders. The ornate room, filled with priceless artifacts and portraits of his ancestors, seemed to whisper the expectations of generations past. Charles had always been different from other royals. Even as a young prince, he questioned the rigid protocols that governed every aspect of royal life. While his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had embraced tradition with unwavering dedication, Charles found himself struggling with the ancient customs that seemed increasingly outdated in the modern world. The practice of bowing and curtsying, in particular, had become a source of deep personal conflict for him. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. During a state dinner, he had watched as elderly dignitaries and distinguished guests, some older than himself, had struggled to perform the traditional bow. One elderly ambassador had nearly fallen while attempting the gesture, his frail body betraying him in a moment that should have been dignified. Charles had felt a sharp pang of discomfort watching the scene unfold, questioning whether such formal displays of deference were truly necessary in the 21st century. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had noticed the king's troubled expression throughout the evening. The two men had worked together for years, and Sir Clive understood Charles's progressive mindset better than most. He knew the king struggled with balancing his personal beliefs about equality and human dignity with the ancient traditions that defined the monarchy. As Charles sat reviewing his schedule for the coming weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to the times while maintaining its core values, but perhaps it was time for another evolution. He thought about his late mother, who had modernized many aspects of royal life during her remarkable 70-year reign, from allowing cameras into the coronation ceremony to embracing technology and social media. The king's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. His aide entered with the morning newspapers, their headlines filled with the usual mix of political news and celebrity gossip. But Charles's attention was drawn to a small article buried on page 7 of the Times. It was about a young girl from Manchester who had written to him, asking why people had to bow to him when her teacher had taught her that all people were equal. The letter itself lay on his desk, written in careful child's handwriting on lined school paper. 8-year-old Emma Thompson had asked the most direct question imaginable. "Your Majesty, if God made all people equal like my teacher says, why do grown-ups have to bow down to you? It makes me confused because my mom says I should never bow down to anyone except God." Charles read the letter again, struck by the innocent wisdom of the child's words. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought to himself. This little girl had articulated something he had been feeling for decades, but had never quite been able to express so simply. The question cut to the heart of his struggle with royal protocol and his genuine belief in human equality. He walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where gardeners were tending to the autumn flowers. These were hard-working people who served the crown with dedication, yet they were expected to bow and curtsy in his presence. Charles knew many of them personally, had conversations about their families and their lives, yet the formal barrier of royal protocol always stood between them. The king remembered his time in the Navy, where he had served alongside men from all walks of life. On ship, while his rank was respected, there was a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect that transcended social barriers. He had felt more comfortable in that environment than he ever did in the formal atmosphere of royal ceremonies. His phone buzzed with a message from his son, Prince William, who was dealing with his own challenges as the heir apparent. William represented a new generation of royals who understood the need to connect with ordinary people while respecting tradition. Charles wondered what his son would think about his growing doubts regarding royal protocol. The king's personal chaplain had often spoken about the concept of servant leadership, the idea that true leadership came from serving others rather than being served by them. This philosophy resonated deeply with Charles, who had spent decades championing causes like environmental protection and urban renewal, always trying to use his position to help rather than to elevate himself above others. As he prepared for his afternoon appointments, Charles made a decision that would surprise even his closest advisors. He instructed Sir Clive to arrange a private meeting with representatives from various Commonwealth countries, religious leaders, and constitutional experts. He wanted to discuss the possibility of modernizing certain aspects of royal protocol, particularly the practice of bowing and curtsying. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. Charles knew he was treading on sacred ground, touching traditions that had remained unchanged for centuries, but he also knew that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to remain relevant and respected in a changing world. That evening, as he walked through the palace corridors lined with portraits of his predecessors, Charles felt the weight of history, but also the possibility of change. He thought about Emma Thompson's letter, about the elderly ambassador who had nearly fallen, about all the people who had bent their backs in deference to a crown, rather than receiving the respect they deserved as fellow human beings. The king had made up his mind. It was time for the royal family to lead by example in demonstrating that true respect came not from elaborate displays of subservience, but from recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. The conversation he was about to start would send shockwaves through the establishment, but Charles believed it was a conversation whose time had finally come. As he settled into his evening routine, the king felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow he would begin the process of sharing his thoughts with the world, starting a dialogue that would challenge centuries of tradition, but hopefully create a more egalitarian and respectful monarchy for future generations. The following morning brought unexpected challenges to Buckingham Palace, as news of the king's planned meetings began to circulate among palace staff. Word traveled quickly through the corridors, from the senior courtiers to the housekeeping staff, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Sir Clive Alderton found himself fielding calls from concerned officials who had gotten wind of the king's intentions to discuss changes to royal protocol. The first crisis came during the weekly meeting with the Lord Chamberlain, who oversees all ceremonial aspects of the royal household. Lord Parker, a traditionalist in his 70s who had served the royal family for over 3 decades, was visibly shaken when Sir Clive briefed him on the king's plans. His face turned pale as he realized the implications of what Charles was proposing. This could undermine the very foundation of the monarchy, Lord Parker declared, his voice trembling with emotion. The ceremony of bowing and curtsying isn't just about respect. It's about the sacred nature of the crown itself. Without these traditions, what separates us from any other political figure? Charles had anticipated this reaction, but hearing it voiced so forcefully still gave him pause. He understood that for many people, especially those who had dedicated their lives to royal service, these traditions represented something sacred and unchangeable. Yet he also knew that change, however difficult, was sometimes necessary for growth and survival. The king decided to start with a smaller, more personal approach. He arranged to meet with the palace staff in small groups, beginning with those who worked closest to him daily. The first group included his valet, personal chef, private secretary, and head of security. These were people who saw him not just as a monarch, but as a human being with daily routines, concerns, and vulnerabilities. When the group gathered in the king's private sitting room, the atmosphere was notably tense. The staff members sat rigidly, unsure of what to expect from this unusual meeting. Charles began by asking them to speak freely, assuring them that their jobs were secure regardless of their opinions. He then shared Emma Thompson's letter with them, reading it aloud in his measured, thoughtful voice. "I've been thinking about young Emma's question," Charles said, setting the letter down on the coffee table. "She asks why adults must bow to me if all people are equal. It's made me reflect on whether our traditional protocols truly serve their intended purpose in today's world." His valet, James Morrison, who had worked for the royal family for 15 years, was the first to speak. "Your Majesty, with respect, the bowing and curtsying isn't about inequality. It's about showing respect for the institution you represent. When we bow, we're honoring the crown, not diminishing ourselves." The head chef, Maria Santos, offered a different perspective. "I come from Spain originally, and when my family visits, they're always nervous about the protocol. My elderly mother worries for weeks about whether she'll curtsy correctly. It creates anxiety rather than respect." The conversation continued for over an hour, with each staff member sharing their thoughts and experiences. Charles listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. He was particularly moved by the security chief's observation that many foreign dignitaries seemed uncomfortable with the formal protocols, sometimes appearing more focused on getting the ceremony right than on the actual diplomatic discussions. Later that afternoon, Charles received an unexpected visitor. Princess Anne, his sister, had driven up from Gloucestershire specifically to discuss the rumors she had heard about his plans. Known for her straightforward manner and deep respect for tradition, Anne represented another perspective he needed to consider. "Charles, I understand your good intentions," Anne said as they walked through the palace gardens, "but you must consider the broader implications. The Commonwealth realms look to us for stability and continuity. If we start changing fundamental protocols, where does it end?" The king appreciated his sister's directness. Anne had always been one of the hardest-working royals, never shying away from her duties or seeking to modernize them for personal comfort. Her concerns carried significant weight because they came from someone who had fully embraced the traditional royal role. "I'm not suggesting we abandon all protocol," Charles explained. "I'm questioning whether requiring people to physically bow and curtsy is still appropriate. We could maintain respect and dignity through other means, perhaps a simple handshake or nod of acknowledgement." Anne paused by a fountain, watching the water cascade over the carved stone figures. "You realize the media will have a field day with this. They'll either portray you as a revolutionary destroying tradition or as weak for abandoning royal dignity. There's no middle ground in their coverage." That evening, Charles spoke with his eldest son, Prince William, via video call. William was in Norfolk with his family, but the serious nature of their conversation was evident even through the screen. As heir to the throne, William's opinion carried enormous significance for any changes to royal protocol. "Dad, I understand your reasoning," William said carefully, "but I worry about the timing. We're still relatively new to our roles after grandmother's passing. Major changes might seem disrespectful to her memory." The comment stung because Charles knew there was truth in it. His mother had been a master of gradual, careful change, never making dramatic departures from tradition. She had modernized the monarchy through subtle adjustments rather than bold declarations. Perhaps he was being too hasty in his approach. However, William surprised him by adding, "That said, Catherine and I have noticed similar issues at events. Last month, an elderly veteran struggled so much with his bow that he nearly injured himself. We had to steady him, and he was embarrassed rather than honored by the interaction." The conversation with his son gave Charles new hope that his concerns weren't simply the misguided thoughts of an aging monarch. If the next generation was noticing the same problems, perhaps change was indeed necessary. That night, Charles called his youngest son, Prince Harry, in California. Despite their complicated relationship following Harry's departure from royal duties, Charles valued his son's perspective as someone who had experienced royal protocol from both sides. Harry's response was characteristically direct. "Dad, I think you're asking the right questions," Harry said, "but be prepared for massive resistance. The establishment will fight this because it threatens their perception of order and hierarchy. You'll need to be strategic about how you approach it." As Charles prepared for bed that evening, he reflected on the day's conversations. The range of opinions had been broader than he expected, but one thing was clear. This was not a decision he could make in isolation. Any changes to royal protocol would need to be carefully considered, thoroughly discussed, and gradually implemented. He picked up Emma Thompson's letter one more time, reading her innocent question about equality and respect. Tomorrow he would begin reaching out to constitutional experts and Commonwealth representatives. The conversation was just beginning, but Charles felt more convinced than ever that it was a conversation worth having. The following week brought a series of carefully arranged private meetings at Clarence House, away from the formal atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. Charles had decided that these sensitive discussions needed to take place in a more intimate setting, where people might feel more comfortable expressing their honest opinions. The first meeting was with Professor Margaret Blackwood, a constitutional law expert from Oxford University, who had written extensively about the evolution of monarchical traditions. Professor Blackwood arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase filled with historical documents and research papers. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that had studied centuries of royal protocol. Charles greeted her personally, something that immediately broke down the formal barriers that might have hindered their conversation. Your Majesty, I must say I was intrigued by your request to discuss the historical significance of bowing and curtsying, Professor Blackwood began as they settled into comfortable chairs in the king's study. These practices have indeed evolved considerably over the centuries. Charles leaned forward, genuinely interested in her academic perspective. Professor, I'm particularly curious about when and why these specific forms of deference became so rigidly codified. Were they always as formal as they are today? The professor opened her briefcase and retrieved several old documents. Actually, Your Majesty, the practices were quite different in earlier periods. Medieval bowing was more practical. It demonstrated that someone wasn't carrying weapons. The elaborate curtsying we see today largely developed during the Victorian era, as part of an effort to emphasize social hierarchy during a time of rapid social change. This historical context fascinated Charles. He had always assumed these traditions dated back to the earliest days of the monarchy, but learning they were relatively recent additions changed his perspective considerably. So these aren't ancient sacred traditions that have remained unchanged for 1,000 years? Not at all, Professor Blackwood replied with a slight smile. Your great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, actually modified many court ceremonies to suit her preferences and the needs of her time. She believed the monarchy needed to appear more dignified and separate from ordinary society to maintain respect during the Industrial Revolution. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Professor Blackwood explaining how various monarchies around the world had adapted their protocols over time. She mentioned that several European royal families had already simplified their court ceremonies, maintaining respect while reducing the physical demands on guests and dignitaries. The next day brought a very different perspective when Charles met with Archbishop Williams, the senior cleric who had conducted his coronation ceremony. The archbishop represented the spiritual dimension of monarchy, the belief that the crown carried divine authority that required specific forms of reverence. Your Majesty, I understand your compassionate concerns about the physical difficulties some people experience with traditional greetings, the archbishop said, his tone respectful but cautious. However, we must consider that these practices serve a spiritual purpose beyond mere social convention. Charles had expected this argument and had prepared thoughtfully for it. Archbishop, doesn't our faith teach us that all people are equal in God's eyes? If that's true, shouldn't our practices reflect that fundamental equality? The archbishop paused, clearly wrestling with the theological implications of the king's question. That's a profound point, Your Majesty. Perhaps we could explore ways to maintain the sacred nature of royal encounters while making them more accessible to people of all ages and abilities. This conversation proved more productive than Charles had anticipated. Rather than rigid opposition, he found a willingness to explore theological justifications for change. The archbishop even suggested consulting with religious leaders from other faith communities to understand how they balanced respect for authority with beliefs about human equality. The most challenging meeting came when Charles sat down with representatives from the Commonwealth realms. Sir David Richardson, the High Commissioner from Canada, and Lady Patricia Foster from Australia joined the discussion via secure video link, while Ambassador James Mwangi from Kenya attended in person. Your Majesty, we appreciate your thoughtful approach to this sensitive matter, Sir David began. However, we must consider how changes to royal protocol might be perceived in our respective countries. Many of our citizens view the traditional ceremonies as an important link to our shared heritage. Ambassador Mwangi offered a different perspective that surprised everyone in the room. In Kenya, we've actually had discussions about this very issue. Many of our elderly leaders find the physical demands of traditional greetings challenging, and some have suggested that a warm handshake might be more appropriate for the 21st century. Lady Foster from Australia was more cautious. We need to be very careful about how any changes are presented to the public. Australians respect tradition, but they also value equality and practicality. If changes are made, they must be explained as updates to tradition rather than abandonments of it. The conversation revealed the complex international dimensions of any changes to royal protocol. What might seem like a simple internal British matter actually affected relationships with dozens of countries around the world. Charles realized he would need to move even more carefully than he had initially planned. That evening, Charles received an unexpected phone call from his cousin, Peter Phillips, who had always maintained a more private relationship with the royal family. Peter's perspective as someone who grew up close to the royals but lived a relatively normal adult life provided unique insights. "Charles, I've heard whispers about what you're considering," Peter said. "I think you should know that most of my friends and colleagues have always found the bowing and curtsying a bit antiquated. They do it out of respect, but it doesn't feel natural to them." This conversation was particularly valuable because Peter moved in circles that included both ordinary citizens and people with connections to the establishment. His observations about public attitudes carried weight because they came from someone with a foot in both worlds. The king's most emotional conversation came when he spoke with his longtime friend and mentor, Sir John Thompson, who had served as his private secretary during his years as Prince of Wales. Sir John was now in his 80s and had been struggling with mobility issues. "Your Majesty, I must confess something," Sir John said during their private lunch. "At recent ceremonies, I've found the bowing increasingly difficult. My arthritis makes it painful, but I've been too proud to admit it. Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that respect can be shown in ways that don't require physical struggle." This personal admission, from someone Charles deeply respected, crystallized his feelings about the issue. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to royal service, yet he was suffering in silence to maintain traditions that might no longer serve their intended purpose. As the week of meetings concluded, Charles felt he had gathered a wealth of perspectives that would inform his decision. The historical evidence suggested that change was not only possible, but had been a constant throughout royal history. The theological arguments weren't as clear-cut as he had expected, with room for interpretation on both sides. The international implications were complex but not insurmountable, and the personal stories had reinforced his belief that compassion should guide his decision. Most importantly, he had learned that he wasn't alone in questioning these traditions. People from all walks of life, from academic experts to Commonwealth officials to personal friends, had been having similar thoughts. The conversation he was starting might be more welcome than he had initially feared. 3 weeks after his initial meetings, King Charles found himself facing an unexpected test of his evolving views on royal protocol. A state visit from the President of Ghana was scheduled, and the traditional ceremony would require dozens of elderly dignitaries to bow and curtsy during the formal reception. The king saw this as an opportunity to quietly implement some of the changes he had been considering. The morning of the state visit, Charles called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Sir Clive Alderton, Lord Parker, and the Master of the Household gathered in the king's private office, expecting routine last-minute adjustments to the day's schedule. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of what would later be described as the most significant protocol discussion in decades. "I want to make some adjustments to today's receiving line," Charles announced, his tone calm but determined. "For anyone who appears to have difficulty with the traditional bow or curtsy, I want our staff to quietly indicate that a handshake or simple nod will be perfectly acceptable." Lord Parker's face went ashen. "Your Majesty, we cannot make such changes on the day of a state visit. The guests have been briefed on proper protocol, and any deviation could cause confusion and embarrassment." Sir Clive, however, had been anticipating this moment since their conversations began. "Actually, my lord, we could have our protocol officers discreetly mention to guests as they enter that His Majesty is happy to accept any form of respectful greeting they feel comfortable with." The king appreciated his private secretary's diplomatic solution. Rather than abandoning protocol entirely, they would simply offer alternatives to those who might need them. This approach would test the waters without creating a dramatic departure from tradition. The first guest to test the new approach was Dr. Kwame Asante, Ghana's 80-year-old former president who was attending as part of the visiting delegation. As he approached the king in the receiving line, a protocol officer quietly mentioned that His Majesty would be happy to accept whatever greeting felt most comfortable. Dr. Asante's relief was visible as he chose a warm handshake instead of attempting the formal bow his age might have made difficult. Charles was struck by how natural and dignified the interaction felt. Dr. Asante maintained his composure and respect while avoiding potential physical discomfort. The exchange seemed to embody exactly what the king had been hoping to achieve: respect without struggle, dignity without deference. The real test came when Lady Margaret Thornbury, A 90-year-old member of the British establishment, known for her strict adherence to tradition, approached the king. She had been preparing to curtsy as she had done for decades, but when she heard the protocol officer's quiet words, she paused with surprise. "Your Majesty, are you certain?" she whispered, clearly conflicted between relief and concern about propriety. Charles smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Lady Margaret, your presence here honors us regardless of how you choose to greet me." The elderly lady's face lit up with gratitude as she accepted the handshake. Later, she would tell her friends that the king's kindness had saved her from what would have been a humiliating struggle with arthritic knees. However, not everyone appreciated the flexibility. Sir Reginald Harwood, a traditionalist member of Parliament, made a point of performing an elaborate bow, clearly signaling his disapproval of any departures from established protocol. His gesture was so exaggerated that it seemed almost theatrical, drawing uncomfortable glances from other guests. The most meaningful moment came when President Akufo-Addo of Ghana was officially received. Charles had specifically requested that their greeting be natural and comfortable, focusing on the diplomatic importance of the visit rather than ceremonial formalities. The two leaders shook hands warmly, and their conversation immediately turned to substantive matters of mutual interest. The media coverage of the event was mixed but largely positive. Royal correspondents noted the more relaxed atmosphere without initially understanding the deliberate changes that had been made. Some commented on how natural and comfortable the interactions appeared, particularly between the king and elderly guests. That evening, at the state banquet, Charles took an unprecedented step. During his speech welcoming the Ghanaian delegation, he made a subtle but significant reference to the day's events. "Today reminded me that true respect between nations and individuals isn't measured by the formality of our gestures, but by the sincerity of our interactions and the depth of our mutual understanding," he said, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge the changes without explicitly announcing them. President Akufo-Addo, in his response, picked up on the king's theme. "Your Majesty's gracious welcome today demonstrated that dignity and respect take many forms, and the most meaningful are those that come naturally from the heart." The exchange didn't go unnoticed by the royal correspondents present, who began to sense that something significant was happening beneath the surface of the official ceremonies. The following morning brought a flood of responses to the previous day's events. The palace received numerous letters from elderly people who had attended royal events in the past, expressing gratitude for what they saw as a more inclusive approach. One letter that particularly moved Charles came from Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, an 85-year-old war veteran who had struggled with protocol at a previous garden party. "Your Majesty, yesterday's news showed me that you understand the dignity of aging," she wrote. "I've avoided royal events since my hip replacement because I feared embarrassing myself with an improper curtsy. Knowing that my respect can be shown through other means makes me feel included rather than excluded from occasions that should celebrate all your subjects." However, criticism also emerged from traditionalist quarters. The Daily Telegraph published an editorial questioning whether the monarchy was abandoning its standards and warning about the slippery slope of protocol changes. The piece was written by Jeremy Hancock, a royal historian who had long advocated for maintaining traditional ceremonies unchanged. Charles read the criticism carefully, understanding that it represented genuine concerns about preserving the institution's character. He instructed Sir Clive to arrange a meeting with Mr. Hancock and other traditionalist voices to hear their perspectives directly. More encouraging was the response from Commonwealth governments. The Canadian Prime Minister's office sent a private message expressing support for inclusive approaches to royal protocol that reflect modern values while maintaining appropriate respect. Similar messages arrived from Australia and New Zealand. The King's own family had mixed reactions. Princess Anne remained skeptical but acknowledged that the changes had been implemented thoughtfully. Prince William expressed cautious support, noting that the media coverage had been largely positive and that the dignity of the occasions had been maintained. The most unexpected response came from an international source. King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands called personally to discuss the changes, revealing that he had been considering similar modifications to Dutch royal protocol. "Charles, we've been having similar conversations here," the Dutch king explained. Your approach yesterday might give us the precedent we need to make our own ceremonies more accessible. This international perspective helped Charles realize that his concerns weren't unique to the British monarchy. Royal families across Europe were grappling with how to maintain tradition while adapting to changing social expectations and demographic realities. As he reflected on the day's events and their aftermath, Charles felt that his gradual approach was working. By making quiet adjustments rather than dramatic announcements, he was able to test new approaches while maintaining the overall dignity and respect that royal ceremonies required. The success of the Ghanaian state visit had given him confidence to continue exploring these changes, but he also understood that each step needed to be carefully considered and implemented with sensitivity to all stakeholders involved. 2 months after the successful Ghanaian state visit, King Charles faced his biggest challenge yet when preparations began for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. This gathering would bring together leaders from 54 nations, many accompanied by elderly advisors and dignitaries who would be expected to follow traditional royal protocol during multiple ceremonial events. The pressure was immense because this wasn't just a bilateral meeting but a multilateral gathering that would be watched by billions around the world. Every gesture, every ceremony, and every protocol decision would be scrutinized by media outlets across the Commonwealth and beyond. Charles knew that this event would either validate his gradual approach to modernizing royal traditions or expose it as impractical on a larger scale. The king convened a special committee to plan what he privately called Protocol 2.0, a modernized approach that would maintain dignity while prioritizing accessibility and comfort. The committee included Sir Clive Alderton, representatives from several Commonwealth nations, disability rights advocates, and surprisingly Emma Thompson's teacher, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, whose student's letter had started this entire journey. Mrs. Mitchell brought a perspective that none of the traditional royal advisors could offer. As an elementary school teacher, she understood how to explain complex concepts in simple, accessible terms. More importantly, she represented the voice of ordinary citizens who would be watching these events and forming opinions about the monarchy's relevance to their lives. Your Majesty, children ask the most direct questions because they haven't learned to accept things simply because they've always been that way, Mrs. Mitchell explained during one committee meeting. Emma's question about bowing resonated with many families because it highlighted something many adults feel but don't voice. The committee's work was complicated by strong opposition from several quarters. A group of former courtiers, led by Sir Pemberton Davies, who had served Queen Elizabeth II for over 40 years, formed what they called the Protocol Preservation Society. They began writing letters to newspapers and making appearances on television programs, arguing that any changes to royal ceremonies would undermine the monarchy's authority and dignity. Sir Pemberton's most damaging intervention came during a BBC interview where he claimed that the king was caving to political correctness and abandoning centuries of tradition for the sake of modern sensibilities. The interview was replayed extensively on social media, creating the first significant public debate about Charles's evolving approach to royal protocol. The king felt the criticism deeply, not because he disagreed with his direction, but because he understood the genuine concerns behind it. These were people who had dedicated their lives to serving the crown and believed they were protecting something sacred from unnecessary change. Charles decided to address the criticism head-on by arranging a private dinner with Sir Pemberton and several other traditionalist voices. The evening was held at Clarence House, away from the formal atmosphere of the palace, in hopes of encouraging honest dialogue. Sir Pemberton, I want you to know that I don't take these decisions lightly, Charles began as they gathered around the dining table. My goal isn't to abandon tradition, but to ensure that our traditions continue to serve their intended purpose of showing respect and maintaining dignity. Sir Pemberton was direct in his response. Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, some traditions exist precisely because they've proven their worth over centuries. The moment we start picking and choosing which ones to keep, we risk losing the essential character that makes the monarchy unique. The conversation continued late into the evening, with both sides presenting thoughtful arguments. Charles shared stories from recent events where traditional protocols had created difficulties rather than enhancing dignity. Sir Pemberton countered with examples of how formal ceremonies had inspired respect and awe in participants from around the world. The breakthrough came when Charles asked Sir Pemberton to describe his most memorable royal ceremony from his years of service. The older man's face softened as he recalled a garden party where Queen Elizabeth II had spent extra time speaking with a young disabled veteran who had struggled to bow but whose obvious pride in meeting the Queen had been deeply moving. That young man's dignity wasn't diminished by his physical limitations, Charles observed gently. Her Majesty's respect for him wasn't reduced because his bow wasn't perfect. Perhaps we can find ways to ensure that everyone can experience that same sense of dignity and inclusion. Sir Pemberton was quiet for a long moment before responding. Your Majesty, I hadn't considered it from that perspective. Perhaps there's room for flexibility within tradition, rather than abandonment of it. This conversation marked a turning point in the internal discussions about protocol reform. Rather than viewing the issue as tradition versus modernity, they began exploring how to maintain the essential spirit of royal ceremonies while making them more accessible. The committee's final recommendations for the Commonwealth meeting were carefully crafted to address these concerns. Traditional ceremonies would remain largely unchanged, but protocol officers would be trained to offer alternatives to anyone who might need them. Most importantly, these alternatives would be presented as equally respectful options rather than lesser substitutes. The king also made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He would personally write a letter to Emma Thompson, thanking her for her question and explaining how it had influenced his thinking. The letter would be released to the media just before the Commonwealth meeting, providing context for any changes observers might notice. Dear Emma, the letter began, your question about why people bow to me made me think very carefully about what respect really means. I've learned that true respect comes from treating all people with dignity, and sometimes our old ways of showing respect can accidentally make some people feel uncomfortable or left out. The letter went on to explain that the Commonwealth meeting would include some new approaches to royal greetings, designed to ensure that everyone could participate comfortably while still showing appropriate respect for the monarchy and the important work of the Commonwealth. When the letter was released, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents across the Commonwealth shared it with their children, sparking family conversations about respect, tradition, and inclusion. Emma herself was interviewed by local media, where she expressed delight that her question had been taken seriously by the king. The letter also served to reframe the public debate. Instead of focusing on the abandonment of tradition, media coverage began emphasizing the monarchy's responsiveness to citizen concerns and its commitment to inclusive practices. However, not everyone was pleased with this development. Some Republican voices criticized the letter as a publicity stunt designed to deflect attention from more serious questions about monarchy's relevance in democratic societies. Constitutional scholars debated whether the king was overstepping his role by engaging in what some viewed as political commentary on social issues. Charles was prepared for these criticisms and chose not to respond directly to them. He understood that any significant change would generate debate, and he preferred to let his actions speak louder than his words. The true test would come during the Commonwealth meeting itself, where the world would see whether his modernized approach could maintain dignity while improving accessibility. As the opening ceremonies approached, Charles felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had spent months preparing for this moment, consulting with experts, listening to critics, and carefully planning every detail. Now he would discover whether his vision of a more inclusive monarchy could work in practice on the world stage. The evening before the Commonwealth leaders arrived, Charles walked through the reception halls where the ceremonies would take place, imagining how different people might experience these spaces and interactions. He thought about elderly dignitaries who might struggle with traditional greetings, young leaders who might appreciate a more relaxed approach, and citizens around the world who would be watching to see whether the monarchy could adapt while maintaining its essential character. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting opened on a crisp October morning, with more than usual anticipation. Media outlets from around the world had stationed their teams outside Buckingham Palace. not just to cover the political discussions but to observe any changes to the traditional ceremonial protocols that had governed such events for decades. King Charles stood in the grand entrance hall, wearing his formal morning dress, feeling the weight of both tradition and innovation on his shoulders. Today would be the most public test of his evolving approach to royal protocol, watched by an estimated global audience of over 2 billion people across the Commonwealth nations. The first delegation to arrive was from Jamaica, led by Prime Minister Andrew Holness, accompanied by several elderly advisors, including the 93-year-old former Governor-General, Sir Patrick Allen. As they approached the receiving line, Charles noticed Sir Patrick's careful, slow movements and realized this would be the first real test of his new approach. The protocol officer, trained in the new procedures, quietly mentioned to Sir Patrick that His Majesty would be honored by whatever form of greeting he felt most comfortable with. The relief on the elderly statesman's face was immediate and touching. Instead of attempting a difficult bow, Sir Patrick offered a dignified nod and warm handshake, which Charles received with obvious pleasure and respect. "Sir Patrick, your presence here honors us all," Charles said, holding the handshake a moment longer than protocol traditionally required. "Your years of service to Jamaica and the Commonwealth are an inspiration." The exchange was captured by cameras and would later be described by royal correspondents as representing a new era of accessibility in royal ceremonies. The dignity of the moment was enhanced rather than diminished by the practical accommodation. The most watched arrival was that of President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, representing a nation with a complex relationship to British royal traditions. Charles had specifically requested that their greeting be natural and focused on the substance of their relationship rather than ceremonial formalities. The two leaders shook hands warmly, immediately beginning a conversation about climate change initiatives that both nations were pursuing. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau arrived with his characteristic informality, but even he seemed touched by the more relaxed atmosphere. "Your Majesty, this feels much more natural than previous ceremonies," he commented quietly as they exchanged greetings. "It allows us to focus on the real work we're here to do." The most emotionally significant moment came when the delegation from Bangladesh arrived, led by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, accompanied by several elderly freedom fighters from the 1971 independence movement. These were men and women in their 80s and 90s who had fought for their country's independence and deserved to be greeted with maximum respect and minimum physical difficulty. One freedom fighter, Mr. Abdul Rahman, had lost a leg during the Independence War and walked with great difficulty using a cane. When the protocol officer quietly explained the flexible greeting options, tears came to his eyes. "In all my years, I never imagined I would meet the British King without worrying about whether I could bow properly," he said softly. Charles approached Mr. Rahman personally, extending both hands in a gesture that clearly conveyed deep respect. "Sir, your sacrifice for your nation's freedom commands our highest admiration. Thank you for being here." The moment was captured by photographers and would later become one of the most widely shared images from the entire conference. However, not all reactions were positive. When the delegation from a traditional monarchy in the Pacific arrived, their elderly protocol chief, Lord Tuiafitu, made a point of performing an elaborate traditional bow, clearly signaling his preference for maintaining established ceremonies. Charles received the gesture with appropriate dignity, demonstrating that traditional protocols were still welcome, alongside the more flexible alternatives. The real test came during the afternoon reception, where hundreds of delegates, advisors, and dignitaries mingled in a less formal setting. Charles moved through the crowd, personally greeting as many attendees as possible. The atmosphere was noticeably more relaxed than at previous Commonwealth gatherings, with conversations flowing more naturally and elderly attendees appearing more comfortable and engaged. Dr. Nalaka Godahewa, an 87-year-old constitutional scholar from Sri Lanka, later wrote in his journal, "I have attended royal receptions for over 40 years, and this was the first time I felt like a welcomed guest rather than a nervous performer worried about protocol mistakes. The King's approach allowed us to focus on the meaningful discussions we came here to have." The evening state banquet provided another opportunity to test the new approaches. During his speech, Charles made what many observers considered the most significant statement of his reign regarding royal protocol and traditions. The Commonwealth represents 54 nations united not by rigid uniformity, but by shared values of respect, dignity, and mutual understanding, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the banquet hall. Our ceremonies and traditions should reflect these values, ensuring that every person, regardless of age, ability, or background, can participate fully in the important work we do together. The speech was interrupted by spontaneous applause, particularly from delegations representing nations with large elderly populations. The king continued, "True respect is not measured by the perfection of our gestures, but by the sincerity of our intentions and the inclusiveness of our approach." The media response to the day's events was overwhelmingly positive. Royal correspondent Jenny Bond wrote in the Times, "Today we witnessed not the abandonment of royal tradition, but its thoughtful evolution. The king has shown that dignity and accessibility are not mutually exclusive." International coverage was equally favorable. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation noted that King Charles's approach seems to have struck exactly the right balance between maintaining respect for the monarchy and ensuring that royal ceremonies are welcoming to all participants. However, some criticism emerged from unexpected quarters. An editorial in The Spectator questioned whether the changes went far enough, suggesting that the monarchy should consider even more dramatic reforms to demonstrate its commitment to equality. This criticism from the left surprised Charles, who had expected opposition primarily from traditionalist conservatives. More concerning was a statement from the Protocol Preservation Society, which announced plans to petition Parliament regarding what they called unauthorized changes to constitutional ceremonies. Sir Pemberton Davies, despite his earlier private conversation with the king, felt compelled to join this formal opposition due to pressure from other traditionalists. The king's most important validation came from an unexpected source, Queen Margrethe II of Denmark, who called personally to express her admiration for his approach. "Charles, you've shown remarkable wisdom in adapting traditions while maintaining their essential dignity," she said. "Several European monarchies are watching your example with great interest." As the Commonwealth meeting concluded, Charles reflected on the week's events with a sense of cautious optimism. The practical implementation of his protocol reforms had worked better than he had dared hope, with participants responding positively to the increased flexibility and accessibility. Most importantly, the ceremonies had maintained their essential character while becoming more inclusive. The dignity of the monarchy had been preserved while extending its welcome to a broader range of participants. The global media coverage had been largely positive, framing the changes as thoughtful modernization rather than abandonment of tradition. That evening, as Charles reviewed the week's schedule and prepared for the final ceremony, he received a special delivery, a hand-drawn thank you card from Emma Thompson, the young girl whose question had started this entire journey. The card showed a picture of the king shaking hands with various people of different ages and abilities, with the words "Thank you for listening" written in careful childish handwriting. Looking at Emma's drawing, Charles felt that all the criticism and controversy had been worthwhile. A child's simple question about equality and respect had led to meaningful changes that would benefit countless people in future royal ceremonies. The monarchy was proving once again that it could evolve while maintaining its essential character and purpose. The final test would come the next morning, during the closing ceremony where world leaders would bid farewell before returning to their nations, carrying with them their impressions of this new approach to royal protocol. 6 months after the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, King Charles sat in his study preparing for what would become known as his most significant televised address since his accession to the throne. The success of the protocol reforms during the Commonwealth gathering had given him the confidence to speak publicly about his vision for a more inclusive monarchy, but he knew that this address would be scrutinized far beyond the Commonwealth nations. The decision to make a formal statement had been prompted by several factors. First, the positive response from world leaders and citizens alike had convinced him that his quiet reforms were ready for broader public discussion. Second, upcoming state visits and the approach of his coronation anniversary provided natural opportunities to implement these changes more widely. Most importantly, letters continued to pour in from citizens expressing gratitude for the more accessible approach to royal ceremonies. Charles had spent weeks crafting his remarks with the help of his closest advisors, including Sir Clive Alderton and, surprisingly, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, the teacher whose student had sparked this entire journey. Mrs. Mitchell's involvement represented Charles's commitment to ensuring his message would resonate with ordinary families across the Commonwealth. Your Majesty, the key is to explain that you're not changing the monarchy, but helping it fulfill its true purpose more effectively, Mrs. Mitchell had advised during one of their preparation sessions. People need to understand that respect and tradition can evolve without losing their meaning. The address was scheduled for a Sunday evening, traditionally a time when families gathered to watch important broadcasts. Charles chose to deliver it from the Oak Room at Windsor Castle, a more intimate setting than the formal throne room, reinforcing his message about accessibility and connection with ordinary citizens. As the cameras rolled, Charles appeared relaxed but dignified, wearing a simple dark suit rather than formal regalia. The setting was designed to feel like a conversation with the nation, rather than a formal royal proclamation. "My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth," he began, his voice warm and sincere, "I want to speak with you tonight about something that has been close to my heart for many months. The question of how we show respect for one another in our modern world." Charles then shared the story of Emma Thompson's letter, reading portions of it aloud and explaining how her innocent question had prompted him to reconsider long-standing royal traditions. The personal nature of this beginning immediately captured viewers' attention and established the human dimension of his message. "Emma asked why people must bow to me if all people are equal," Charles continued. "It's a question that goes to the heart of what monarchy means in the 21st century. I believe the answer lies not in abandoning our traditions, but in ensuring they serve their true purpose of fostering respect, dignity, and unity among all people." The king then explained the gradual changes that had been implemented over recent months, emphasizing that traditional protocols remained available for those who preferred them, while alternatives were offered to ensure everyone could participate comfortably in royal ceremonies. "The essence of monarchy has never been about making people uncomfortable or creating barriers between us," Charles explained. "It has always been about service, about bringing people together, and about demonstrating that every individual deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their age, ability, or background." The most powerful moment in the address came when Charles spoke directly about the elderly veterans, distinguished citizens and international leaders he had met, who had struggled with traditional protocols. Without naming specific individuals, he painted a picture of people whose contributions to society were immense, but whose physical limitations made formal ceremonies challenging. "I have met war heroes who freed nations, scientists who changed the world, and leaders who have dedicated their lives to serving others," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Their worth is not measured by their ability to perform a perfect bow or curtsy, but by the depth of their character and the magnitude of their contributions to our shared humanity." Charles then addressed the criticism that had emerged from traditionalist quarters, acknowledging their concerns while explaining his different perspective. "Some have suggested that these changes somehow diminish the monarchy or abandon our heritage. I respectfully disagree. Our greatest traditions have always been those that bring out the best in people and create opportunities for dignity and respect to flourish." The king's most significant announcement came near the end of his address. "Therefore, I am pleased to announce that beginning immediately, all royal ceremonies and occasions will offer flexible greeting options to ensure that every participant can engage with comfort and dignity. Traditional protocols will always be welcomed and respected, but they will no longer be required for those who prefer alternatives." This formal policy announcement marked the culmination of months of gradual change and careful preparation. By making it official policy rather than informal practice, Charles was ensuring that future royal ceremonies would consistently reflect these values, regardless of who organized them. The address concluded with Charles reading a response he had written to Emma Thompson, which would be delivered to her the following day. "Dear Emma, thank you for teaching me that the best questions are often the simplest ones. Your curiosity about equality and respect has helped me remember that the monarchy exists to serve all people, and that service means ensuring everyone feels welcomed and valued." The immediate response to the address was overwhelmingly positive. Social media filled with messages of support from across the Commonwealth, with particular praise from disability rights organizations, elderly citizens groups, and families who had felt excluded from royal events in the past. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement calling the king's approach a beautiful demonstration of Christian values in action, showing that true leadership serves others rather than demanding service from them. Similar endorsements came from religious leaders across various faiths throughout the Commonwealth. International reaction was equally positive. President Biden released a statement praising the king's thoughtful leadership in making important institutions more accessible and inclusive. European monarchs privately expressed admiration for Charles's courage in addressing these issues publicly. However, some criticism persisted. The Protocol Preservation Society organized a small protest outside Buckingham Palace, carrying signs reading "Preserve Our Traditions and Protocol Matters." Their demonstration attracted modest media attention, but failed to generate significant public support. More significantly, a constitutional law professor at Cambridge University published an article questioning whether the king had exceeded his constitutional role by making unilateral changes to ceremonial protocols. This criticism prompted a broader academic discussion about the balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary oversight. Charles addressed these concerns through Sir Clive Alderton, who explained to the media that the changes fell well within the monarch's traditional authority over court ceremonies and did not require parliamentary approval. The constitutional scholars' concerns were noted, but did not gain widespread support among other legal experts. The most meaningful validation came from Emma Thompson herself, who was interviewed on television the day after the address. Now 9 years old, she expressed delight that her question had been taken so seriously by the king, and said she looked forward to meeting him someday, without worrying about bowing. As weeks passed, the new policies were implemented across various royal events with remarkable success. Garden parties became more inclusive, state visits proceeded more smoothly, and ceremonial occasions maintained their dignity while becoming more accessible. Most importantly, the public response remained positive, with polling showing increased support for the monarchy among younger citizens and minority communities. Charles reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From that first uncomfortable evening, watching elderly dignitaries struggle with protocol, to this public embrace of a more inclusive approach, the monarchy had once again demonstrated its ability to evolve while maintaining its essential character. The king kept Emma Thompson's original letter framed on his desk, a daily reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest questions. Her innocent inquiry about equality and respect had sparked a transformation that would benefit countless people in future generations, proving that the monarchy's greatest strength lay not in rigid tradition, but in its capacity to serve all people with dignity and compassion. Looking ahead, Charles knew that this was just the beginning of his efforts to modernize the monarchy while preserving its essential values. The success of the protocol reforms had given him confidence to explore other ways the royal family could better serve the diverse, modern Commonwealth while maintaining the respect and dignity that had sustained the institution for over 1,000 years.